Welcome to the Erectile Dysfunction Radio Podcast. This is the podcast dedicated to educating and empowering men to address erectile dysfunction, improve confidence, and enhance the satisfaction in their relationships. This podcast is brought to you by ErectionIQ.com. Learn more at ErectionIQ.com.
Welcome to the Erectile Dysfunction Radio Podcast. I am Mark Goldberg, certified sex therapist. I am deeply passionate about working with men like you to help resolve their ED. Today we are joined by Andrew Walen. Andrew is the founder of D.U.D.E Mental Health. He's a psychotherapist and a certified eating disorder specialist with a specific focus on males with eating disorders. Andrew is the immediate past president of the National Association for Males with Eating Disorders. He currently serves as the National Eating Disorder Association's senior advisor on males with eating disorders. He is also a past founding board member of the Binge Eating Disorder Association. What we want to cover on today's episode is the crossroads or the intersection of eating disorders and sexual function and sexual health. So Andrew, I know this might be a big area, so I'm going to try to ask you to help me tease this out a little bit. Is the impact that these eating disorders have on primary intimate relationships in particular, because that is an area that we cover a lot on this podcast, as well as partnered sexual activity is really, really important when we're talking about sexual function and erectile dysfunction. So can you share with us just, I guess on the surface or on a basic level, what some of the impact looks like on people's relationships, certainly if they are in committed relationships with a partner, what this might look like?
Sure. Thank you, first off, for having me. Basically, a loss of intimate connection. I've seen, I've had patients who, for instance, will stay up late so that their partner will go to bed before them because they don't want to be seen. They don't take their shirt off, even with their partner. And they will get up early before their partner wakes up and then, go and exercise. And so that they, can avoid having to be told, you should stop that. It's an avoidance of every aspect of intimacy with their partner. I've had men whose wives will say, he won't touch me, he won't look at me. I feel like leaving because, I don't have a husband anymore. And it's that sense of failure that they feel. That's what I hear a lot about. And they can't get an erection or they can't sustain an erection. They don't want to be seen naked. They have no energy to actually have, the sex. And it's part and parcel of their fixation also keeps them not just physically and sexually away from their partner, but intimately, emotionally. Just even a basic touch is avoided.
I think one of the things that I'm hearing that we haven't really touched on is, I think when you are avoiding but also keeping a secret, or you think you're keeping a secret, it's hard to be genuinely intimate with somebody. And I don't necessarily mean sexually intimate, but it's hard to be seen at the same time that you are holding a secret. And I think that probably is something here that makes intimate connection really challenging. If a lot of your orientation to your relationship is avoidance for the sake of really protecting the secret or protecting the eating disorder, so to speak.
And it's absolutely true. And let's also, I think there's a real danger when we talk about eating disorders of focusing just on the restrictive and emaciated versions, but also we want to focus on those who are struggling with binge eating disorder, whether they are of a normal sized body or a very large sized body. The sense of disgust with themselves. I can't see myself as a sexual being. I can't imagine my partner does. And so the purposeful drawing away from is a huge deal. But let's also add one other twist to this. Many individuals develop eating disorders due to trauma, sexual trauma. And so to have a normal sized body and to have a body that is sexually attractive is avoided as well, because that means I might engage in something that will re-traumatize me.
And is this in particular in the line of binge eating?
All of it. I mean, we see people who will develop anorexic and restrictive behaviors to essentially lose any sense of sexual, connection. I want to be as invisible as possible, as small as possible,
as shapeless as possible, as small as possible.
Yes, as undesirable, and same for men who might, also develop very large bodies and binge behavior. It's a self-soothing that then has the secondary act of becoming larger, which has the secondary benefit of nobody will touch me.
So, can you tell us a little bit about your current therapy practice and its focus?
Sure. The practice that I have is called D.U.D.E Mental Health. And D.U.D.E Mental Health is my practice that treats outpatient for adult men struggling with all manner of issues. But my specific area of specialization, again, is eating disorders. And the eating disorders, people often think of just traditional anorexia, bulimia, but we also have to think about binge eating. We have to think about avoidant and restrictive feeding and intake disorder. We have to talk about other specified feeding and eating disorders. And we have to talk about the concept of muscle dysmorphia, which is where we see the most common experience of male disordered eating occur. So I think a lot of what we want to start and talk about is, what are eating disorders? What do they look like in men? And then we can really dive into, well, how is this related to the experience of sexual health and how they're tied in?
That sounds great. So to get that started, I'm sure many of our listeners are familiar with some of the very well-known eating disorders. So could I ask you to, I guess, kind of give us a breakdown of some of the most common or the most prevalent eating disorders, and again, a brief description of what they generally entail or what the symptoms are of those disorders?
Absolutely. So the one that most everyone talks about is anorexia. And that actually, we see that dating back in history in men to around 1689, where we had a physician who described a young man who was struggling with inability to eat due to, or what they called anxious consumption due to depression and related cares, something along those lines. We see it again in the late 1800s, where the first time they decided to diagnose us with the term anorexia, and they called it anorexia nervosa instead of anorexia hysterica, because men couldn't have hysterica. That was a women's only disease. So we see that men do struggle with these early understandings of eating disorders. Anorexia is essentially, as we describe it now, the fear of normal eating due to fear of fat and fear of and an inability, despite negative consequences, to return to normal, healthy eating. Then we look at bulimia, which is essentially a binge followed by a purge. Now, we think of purging most often as vomiting, but of course, it also encompasses use of laxatives, diuretics, of compulsive exercise, and even just avoiding eating as a way to undo the binge. Then we have classic binge eating, which is the loss of control of eating and the feelings of shame and guilt associated with it afterwards. And those are the three that we're most familiar with. And then there are those subcategories where perhaps the restriction is more related to sensory issues or fear of vomiting or some other kind of issue, that an OCD experience where there's a refusal to eat. But what we see most commonly is a male experience where the drive is not to be thin, which almost all the eating disorders are about restriction in some form, leading to, driven by a desire to be thin. Males don't typically think that way. The drive is to be lean and muscular. The drive is thus about masculinity. And that's where we see this other aspect of muscle dysmorphia. Now, muscle dysmorphia is considered part of the body dysmorphic disorder, which is part of OCD. But when we see this drive for hypermuscularity, even though they might already be a muscular person, it's this fear of not being seen as masculine, as not meeting the expectation of dominance and strength and power. And that is often tied into hyper rigid food behaviors, focus on proteins, focus on very rigid meal times, amounts, pushing more food in the body than is necessary for the drive to gain more muscle mass.
Go ahead. I want to make sure that I and the listeners are following. So what I'm gathering is that a number of the more popularized eating disorders that may be more pertinent or more relevant to women, but not exclusively, are driven by a desire to have a lean physique, to be very, very skinny and narrow, whereas men may have this driven by an image of masculinity, but it may push a increased caloric intake or a specific type of caloric intake in an effort to bulk the body up to some desired perception of muscle mass or a certain body image. Is that correct?
That's right. We see that there is sort of normal muscle building, right? And that is fine. But when it starts to incorporate rigid dietary practices, where I have seen so many men who refuse to go out to eat because they can't control what they're going to eat, or they will only eat a very plain salad, very rigid style. There's a loss of enjoyment in the traditional aspects of life. I will avoid social opportunities because it might interfere with my gym time. I will exercise even if I'm in pain or injured, because I can't imagine what I'm imagining is that all of my muscle gains are going to quickly disappear, which is equivalent to what somebody with classic anorexia would think is, I'm afraid that if I eat this donut, I will immediately become fat. And it's that irrational thought process that is really what would define, for me and many researchers in the male eating disorder field, that muscle dysmorphia with that dietary rigidity and hyper focus on the body image aspect is an eating disorder.
So, Andrew, as a follow-up to help our listeners better understand, so with conditions like anorexia, bulimia, and the like, where there generally is caloric restriction or a purging of calories. We can talk a little bit more about this, but I think it's understandable what the risks are, both in terms of physical health and mental health. Now, when somebody is eating a very restricted, but what seems like potentially a very healthy diet, can you speak to what the potential health impacts are, both physically and mentally, when it comes to this muscular dysmorphia that somebody might be?
Muscle dysmorphia is actually, again, in itself is not an issue. But when the dietary practice becomes unhealthy, it's not that it actually appears healthy, it actually appears unhealthy to the average person. The cutting out of very specific foods, often cutting out carbohydrates, cutting out oils and fats, it looks like what we see with anorexic patients as well, where it is a fear of fat for anorexia, but it's a drive for leanness so that I can see the muscular striations and what have you. What we see is that when the body becomes more and more lean, that the body actually becomes unhealthy. We see high levels of proteins in the blood, which can affect all kinds of organs in the body. We see electrolyte imbalances that can lead to edema, can lead to electrical firing issues where the heart does not regulate appropriately. We can see, unfortunately, we also see high levels of substance use and appearance and performance enhancing drugs in that population, whether it's anabolic steroids or some derivative of those, both legal and illegal in the market. And it can lead to digestive health, cardiac health issues, and most importantly to my world is psychological and social ill health.
And we will definitely come to some of that, which is going to be, I think, very pertinent both on the physical and on the mental aspects and how that pertains to sexuality. But Andrew, before we get to that, I'm wondering, why do you think that this is a particularly taboo topic when it comes to men and eating disorders?
Eating disorders for the last 100 years have been seen as a female disease. And that started out, even though the early researchers, hundreds of years ago to 150 years ago, understood that men and women both suffered from this. What I have seen, and my understanding of it, is they were looking for something very clearly biological that they could pin it on. And so they started looking at loss of menstrual cycle. And that is where the research initially took off 100 some odd years ago. And I think there was an intention probably to go back and find some masculine equivalent, but there wasn't. And the field really focused then on what they had in front of them, which was anorexia. Bulimia didn't even get looked at until, say, 50 years ago, and then binge eating maybe 20 years ago. And so, we're really in the infancy of this field in so many ways. We don't understand its etiology except to say that we know it's a genetic-based disease. And that it's probably best categorized under the anxiety umbrella. It's a fear of a consequence. So admitting to some loss of control, these are language terms that males typically, culturally, don't subscribe to. So in the research, we're asking males the same questions we're asking females, where the language is, emotion-based. And guys don't typically subscribe to that. So the more we've gone along in history, the more males have been left out. And so to say that I have an eating disorder would be to feel like I have a female disease or a gay male disease. And that, again, is for the typical heterosexual cisgender man, a very emasculating thing to admit to. And thus we see so few reaching out for help due to stigma.
And I imagine that there's something paradoxical that the drive sounds like, at least in part, is to achieve an ideal vision or an ideal perception of masculinity.
Yes.
And at the same time, it would be extremely emasculating to reach out for help or to acknowledge that you have a disorder that has, probably unfairly been categorized as a female type of disorder, which probably makes it even more challenging to take that step to reach out for help.
It really is. It really is. And to ask for help in and of itself seems almost emasculating, and then to do it for something that feels like it's not something a male should have to deal with. And the fact is, it's so culturally normed. We used to think that eating disorders, 1 in 10 cases might be male. And the latest epidemiological studies are showing probably 25 to 33% of anorexia and bulimia cases are male. And there's almost no sex disparity in binge eating disorder. And when you start to add in the other subcategories of these disorders, we see men making up a significant portion, and then add the male experience of anorexia, which mostly looks like muscle dysmorphia. And you probably see a near equal, number of people who could be diagnosed if we had better assessment tools.
Andrew, when I think about how various mental health conditions impact sexuality, in particular, impact erections and erectile dysfunction, we look at both the physical and the mental components.
All right.
And in a little bit of an overlap here, it sounds like there are both mental and physical components to these eating disorders. So if we look first just at the physical implications, could I ask you to clarify some of the most common physical impacts that these eating disorders have as they manifest in men?
Absolutely. So certainly with most restrictive eating disorders, we're going to see fatigue. We're going to see anxiety. We're going to see depression. We're going to see a hyper focus on the one thing they can control, which might be food and exercise. So that leaves out pretty much everything else that might be important. And a lot of it is also this, I don't want to be seen by others for many individuals who are struggling with an eating disorder. There's a sense of my body isn't good enough. And so I don't want to take my shirt off. I don't want to be at the beach. I'm going to wear baggy clothes and look as asexual as possible until I feel like I have the body that I should have. The problem with eating disorders is that they never feel like they achieve the body that they want. So for males, one of the things that happens with these diseases is due to malnutrition, we then see not just anxiety and avoidance of social experiences, but we also see loss of sex drive due to very low testosterone levels. I have individuals who are, vibrant young men prior to the development of something as simple as let me try and get healthier. Right? I just want to. During the pandemic, I've had a number of men who were like, I'm just going to focus on my fitness because, I'm stuck at home. Mm-hmm. And that becomes obsessive. And then they go, hey, I kind of like what I see and I feel like I'm stronger. Let me see if I can get a little leaner and get a little more cut. And so they start to restrict a bit. And then that becomes like, boy, I really like this, becomes obsessive, becomes a hyper focus. And next thing they know, sex drive is gone. They have no emotional connection to anything or anybody. And I ask them about, do you even get erections anymore? No. Do you think about sex in any way? No. Have you stopped masturbating? Yes. All of it is basically gone. And the research is really saying that as people are nutritionally recovering, that may take a while to return. That testosterone takes a long time to regenerate. And so there's often a frustration that comes with that, a lack of drive to even do the recovery behaviors. There's just no energy.
It sounds very, very difficult. And certainly there is a pretty strong correlation and link between testosterone levels and libido. One of the other things that I was hearing that you described, you touched on a number of potential paths that could impact sexual interest and erections, including anxiety, depression, body image concerns, fear about masculinity. One of the things that I wonder about, though, is this obsessive thinking that you're talking about, because something that comes up a lot in my office, and certainly a theme that we talk about on this podcast, is the important role that the mind has in facilitating an erection, and how a person has to be not necessarily proactive, but the mind has to be engaged in pleasure-seeking activities. Right. And part of what I'm hearing, maybe in some of the undertones of what you're saying, is that people feel good about the obsession. They feel good about that, but it's not necessarily driven by pleasure. They become almost obsessed with appearance or caloric monitoring or whatnot. Mm-hmm. Does this become a very mind-occupying type of experience for men who are caught up with, who are struggling with this type of condition?
Very much. If we're talking about restrictive disorders like this, or even binge purge behaviors, the hyper focus on food and exercise and body image becomes tunnel vision. And it has an actual benefit, because there is a sense that the world around me is so overwhelming and I don't have control over all of that stuff. What do I have control over? And that's my body, what actually goes into my body and how I move my body. That's literally the only thing we have control over. Now, there is a tie-in to sexuality and body image issues, where this drive to feel attractive and sexualized is often tied into use of drugs like crystal meth, where I see compulsive sexual behavior also being an issue, and using drugs in order to be able to facilitate that. Because there's so much underlying self-loathing about their body, and they need to dissociate from their body, because otherwise they're hyper-focused on their body. And so the dissociating from it and having the energy from a drug like crystal meth can allow them to then participate in sex, but it's the only way they can. And so we see that as another co-occurring experience. And it might also be cocaine. It might also be speed, things like that. But yeah, it's what the eating disorder itself in restrictive behaviors is really gives you that hyper focus. But let's also not forget that binge eating disorder is an eating disorder that also affects men's focus on health and their sexual health. Binging is about a feeling of loss of control, and that I am an awful person and an awful thing. And that sense of depression and awfulness and loss of, autonomy over my own body is often tied into, I can't imagine being with another person. Who could possibly want to be with me?
Sounds like a lot of low self-esteem that comes with that binging disorder. Is that correct?
That's very much true. And it's also about a sort of obsessional behavior about food. I have a thought and I don't have the ability to say, nope, not going to do that. I know I'm full. I don't need to eat. But there's that executive dysfunction, right? That says, nope, I got to go do it. I'm going to go do it. I'm going to go do it. So we also see a lot of compulsive behaviors related to sex and masturbation. And pornography in individuals. And this is anecdotally. There's no research on this. My anecdotal experience is individuals who are often in large bodies who are struggling with binge eating are really also struggling with some kind of compulsive sexual experience.
I'm just taking a couple steps back. It sounds like, though, some of these eating disorders take people in opposite directions, in the sense that it sounds like people who are restricting calories may feel good about themselves initially, may be striving towards something that they believe will make them feel good about themselves.
Yes.
Whereas people who are binging are already in like an element of self-loathing. In other words, they don't feel good about this activity. It's something that they both abhor, but they can't quite get in control over it.
That's right. Well, it's what we would describe in our therapy world as egosyntonic and ego-dystonic, right? So it's egosyntonic to restrict, to diet, to have very clear, rigid dietary rules. It fits in with what our culture says is normal and desirable. And same with going to the gym and being hyper masculine.
Yes, and I think one of the important takeaways, both for myself and I hope for our listeners, is when somebody comes to work on improving erections or erectile dysfunction, I think as a clinician, I look at, well, are you exercising as a healthy lifestyle choice? And a lot of times, if the answer is yes, it's something that I wouldn't really think to probe further about. And sometimes it can be very, very puzzling. Here's a person, they're in shape, they're really taking care of themselves. They seem to be oriented towards their own sense of masculinity. But what could be behind all of that potentially is maybe there is a hidden or some kind of eating disorder or muscle dysmorphia or type of thing, which is really mind occupying and maybe interfering with that process. And I really appreciate you kind of like bringing that out and bringing that to my attention, that it's not as simple as it may appear, that somebody's just in great shape and they're watching what they eat and they're really in tune to their caloric intake, where it may sound all good, but there may be a deeper mental process that not only is interfering with erections, but potentially needs to be addressed for this person's overall well-being.
And that's a really good point. And it's really hard to tease out because males don't often respond to the questions that an eating disorder therapist is typically trained to ask about. So, we talk about in the assessment of males, I look at something like, has there been significant changes in your weight in a given period of time? That typically tells me, for instance, if they've lost more than 5-10% of their weight in say a month, 2 months, 3 months, whatever, that they've done a radical change in their dietary practice. And I want to investigate that a little bit. If they say, no, my dietary practice hasn't changed, but boy, I really amped up my exercise. Okay, let's talk about that and make sure that it's not interfering with their life. Are you still able to go out and go enjoy going to the restaurant? Can you still go out and have the occasional ice cream when the family goes out and has ice cream? Can you miss a day of exercise because you have a cold? It's like basic self-care. Are you doing that? Good. All right. Not necessarily going to worry about it until I see some other signs. But you also look at signs of depression, signs of, work is not going well, signs of my relationships are falling apart. Other family members are saying, I'm kind of worried they're not acting the same like they used to. And, and for athletes in particular, male athletes, let's talk about the fact that it's completely normalized to be rigid about your food and your exercise patterns. We call the International Olympic Committee in the last several years came up with a diagnosis, RED-S, which is relative energy deficiency in sports, so that they can help identify these athletes where this rigid and positive associated behavior can be better assessed. We look for diminished ability to exercise. We look for their performances to decline. We look for injuries that are not healing well. We look for irritability. We look for mood changes for other people who see them and can report back, it seems like things aren't the same. They're not the way they used to be. And so that's essentially the same kind of concept we want to talk about with men in general.
Yeah, these things are really hard, though, to find. And I know that it's something that I ask everybody who I work with, whether you have an eating disorder. Yeah. And it wouldn't really cross my mind necessarily to probe as deep as you're kind of like opening my eyes to, and certainly with the potential crossover impact into sexual function. Because it really kind of hides. It's not so easy if you're not really tuned in to asking the right types of questions, because we do think largely in terms of caloric restriction or binge purge type of terminology, right, without kind of probing any deeper into eating habits or exercise habits or whatnot. Mm-hmm. And I think what makes it even more difficult, and this probably makes your work challenging, is a lot of this stuff is sometimes like viewed positively and praised, that a person is on this diet or they're on that diet, or look how little they consume, or look how well they control their caloric intake, or how often they're working out or whatnot. Yeah. And there is a very, very fine line here between what we praise and what might be a disorder.
And this is where I think a lot of males get misdiagnosed, not diagnosed, et cetera. My behaviors, I struggled for 20 years with an active eating disorder from age 10 till I was 30. And all of my behaviors were seen as normal by the psychiatrists I saw, by the therapists I met with, and the doctors with whom I spoke. which included being hyper rigid about when I was in high school in particular, I became anorexic and I lost 25% of my body weight in 3 months. And everyone, my coaches, I was a 3 varsity sport athlete, and my coaches were celebrating, like, about time, Walen, good job. You finally look like the athlete you say you wanted to be. My father, who I love dearly, he's a physician. And he also is the one who helped me lose that weight. Initially saying, I'll put you on a medically induced, a medically supervised program. I want to help you, son. I am lovingly done, normal, in fact. And instead, I said, I'm going to take it another level because I am by nature a competitive person. So I competed against my own diet. And I took it from, the calories that my father set to reducing it to the point where, I look at the pictures and I see from that era, I'm flat affect. I know that my performance in my sports went way down. I know my mood was irritable and nobody picked up on it. In fact, everybody said, great job. So of course I'm going to keep doing it.
Yeah. The appearances were something that won you affirmation, but I think what you're sharing is, and I appreciate you sharing this personal part of your life with our listeners. What I hear you sharing, though, is that the impact both on just your physical health, but also on your mental health, your mood, and like flat affect and feeling irritable, and it's profound. It really is profound in terms of like how many tentacles an eating disorder really has, and the impact just beyond just the caloric intake and the mind occupyingness of all of that. It can really profoundly change mood, orientation to the world, and whatnot.
And that's huge. I mean, and again, even with the adolescent boys that I work with, in the last 15 years of my work, I've had their primary care doctors who will pat them on the stomach and say, "Boy, I wish I had abs like that." Meanwhile, the kid, their lab values are showing that they're very, very sick, and they, in fact, might even need to be hospitalized. And that's the chaos that we're fighting against. So you can't look at somebody and say they have an eating disorder. You can't. It requires an assessment, and in particular in men with our greater muscle mass and our greater bone density, that's a really big deal. We don't typically look like we have an eating disorder. You have to assess.
Okay, that was really, really informative, Andrew. And I have to say that not only our listeners are going to benefit from this, but I myself have benefited from just like being able to expand my thinking. And as you're probably aware, we're continually learning so much about various aspects of mental health. And this is
absolutely
an area that I really think is relatively cutting edge, in the sense that it's not a well-covered area, but it's so important. It's a really, really important topic. And one of the things that I appreciate about what you're doing with this, and I think it's one of the missions that we have with this podcast and in my work, is to really try to educate people about topics that just carry a tremendous amount of shame and a tremendous amount of taboo, and trying to help people be equipped to identify and to be able to address these challenges with real, solid, workable information, and to really help people bridge the gap to be able to reach out for help, because we're all human, and this is part of the human condition. And I would assume that you share in the mission of just trying to make access to excellent care that much easier for people who really, it takes some courage and gumption to really reach out for that help.
Absolutely. I think the most difficult thing for most men is to say, I don't have to do this by myself. And that our greatest strength is when we have a bond among our peers and can join that sort of fraternity of recovery. That's what I hope we all get to at some point.
Yeah. So again, Andrew, thank you very much for your time. We appreciate you joining us on the podcast. If I don't know if you're accepting new clients at this point, we're happy to.
Anyone who is in the Maryland, DC, and Virginia area, feel free to contact me. It's DUDEMH.com. D.U.D.E Mental Health is the name of my program, and I'm here to help.
Thank you again, Andrew, for all of this. I can't wait to get this out to our listeners to help kind of just expand that knowledge base around sexual function and mental health in general.
Thanks for the opportunity, Mark.
Thanks for listening to the Erectile Dysfunction Radio Podcast. For more information on today's topic and understanding how the mind impacts erectile dysfunction, please visit erectioniq.com. That's erectioniq.com.